When this happens to your networks, how will Azure still be usable? I just spent the last 100 hours testing all of the Azure services to figure out how Azure will work without outbound access to the internet. And I've got some good news and some bad news. Microsoft announced that they're going to disable outbound access to the internet so the cloud can be more secure, which means you can't just sit there and do nothing. This change is going to impact everyone's processes, deployments, and strategies for how we all use the cloud. But the good news is, I'm here to help you learn how you can work in Azure without internet access while helping the product teams on what is and what is not working along the way, so we can all keep things running together. And I'll have a few additional things that you can do to help yourselves throughout this video, so stick around. But to do all of that, you're gonna need one of these. This is a subnet without internet access, and you can start using it today to figure out how things are gonna go in the future and what you need to do to get ready for when the biggest update to Azure happens. Let's start by talking about how the cloud works. All of the Azure services have endpoints that you communicate with, and the primary endpoint faces the internet, and that's our problem. When you try to use anything from storage to key vaults, Azure Virtual Desktop, or any other Azure platform service, your traffic will leave your VM from your subnet and go on the Azure default route, which heads toward the internet. Then at the end, the traffic will hairpin and land on the Azure service's internet-facing endpoint. Now this virtual network has two subnets. The Bastion subnet, which still works because Bastion requires its own public IP address, and another subnet for my VMs. And this one is configured right here to be a private subnet, which is how Azure will be set up for everybody in the future. Now I have a VM in that private subnet, which gets a private IP address from the Azure DHCP service, and since the VM doesn't have a public IP address attached to it, which is a best practice, by the way, don't ever connect a public IP address to your VMs. It's a huge risk. But this means that your VM will have no internet access at all. So the VM can only communicate with things on its own virtual network and any other VNets that it's paired with. And that means when I sign in, my web browser is not going to be able to get anywhere, and Windows even thinks I have no network connection. But let's see what happens when you try to connect to an Azure file share. Go to the share, click connect at the top, copy the code right here, Bastion into your VM, open PowerShell, drop in your code, and run it. And you can see it's trying to talk to this IP address. That's the storage account's internet-facing endpoint. And of course, this fails because you have no way to reach it. So what can you do to fix this? Well, the good news is we can trick Azure. All you need to do is redirect the traffic from the internet-facing endpoint to the service more directly. But you'd have to do that in such a way where the traffic never leaves your private subnet so you don't break any routing. And you'll also need to create a network card in your private subnet that redirects the traffic you want to send to that service directly to the NIC. And I know that sounds like a lot to go through, but it's actually really easy. Just go to your storage account, and on the left, go to networking, and then go to the Private Endpoints tab. Click Create. Your subnet and resource group is probably selected for you. Just give your endpoint a name and pick your region, then click Next. Here you can select the sub-resource of the storage service that you want to use, and if you want more than one of these, you'll have to create a private endpoint for each of them. Click Next, and you can select the virtual network and the subnet where you want the endpoint to live, and that way we can directly communicate with our VM. As for the IP configuration, I usually suggest just to leave this on dynamic, but if you want, you can set it to static. You'll just need to give it a name and know the next available IP address that's available in your subnet. At the bottom is application security groups, which we're gonna skip for now. And then on the next screen, you can create your private DNS zone, and that's going to be associated with your virtual network, so your VMs can use DNS to find your private storage endpoint more easily. Click Next and add all of your standard tags, and then create. And if you want to learn more about how you master the cloud, you should check out my new book, now available on Amazon, The Ultimate Azure IaaS Infrastructure Management Guide, linked right here and in the video description below. Inside our new private endpoint, you can check out your DNS configuration, and you'll have a new network card with the IP address of 10.0.0.5 associated with the file share, and it's got a new DNS name for your private endpoint. Click over there on your DNS zone, and then on the left you can go to the VNet links, which will show you which VNet it's connected to, which is also cool because you can add more than one VNet here so that multiple networks can take advantage of this private endpoint. But there's actually a big catch that I'll tell you about in a second. For now, go back to your file share, click connect at the top, copy the script, bastion back into the VM, run your code in PowerShell, and it still fails. Any idea what could be missing? No? Well, let's try to test the connection to the private endpoint's IP address instead. And it's taking a little bit longer, which is a good sign of what's wrong, and it works. So you know what the problem is? Well, if you go back to your virtual network and you look at your DNS servers, you're probably using a custom DNS entry like I am on all of my networks. So the problem here is the custom DNS doesn't know anything about our new private zone. So let's just see what happens if we switch back to the Azure default DNS. You'll get a warning here that you have to reboot your VMs in order to take advantage of these new settings. So just click save, and after you've rebooted, try PowerShell again, and it resolves the name to the IP address, and it works even though we don't have any internet access. So now we can just run the entire script, open the File Explorer, and there's your file share. Everything's cool. So the keys here were to have your private endpoint with a working DNS solution that's connected to the Azure DNS zone. And again, if you're using custom DNS, no problem. Just update your forward lookup zones with the proper DNS entries, and you're golden. Now, if what I just showed you got you thinking that this is all really just a DNS problem, you'd actually be wrong. The solution was the private endpoint building a network card on the private subnet that gave us a private IP address that redirects the traffic from the internet endpoint directly to the service. DNS just makes our lives a little bit easier. Next, let's look at a really complex scenario. Azure Virtual Desktop requires internet access by its very design. Or does it? I'll quickly build a new pool in the same resource group as before using my private subnet. And I'll be doing Entra Cloud Join, along with the same log analytics and tags and everything else that I always do. But when I build it, it fails. Now the problem here is the session host deployment, and we've got an error that says it couldn't download the DSC package, which contains all the scripts and everything that makes AVD work. So even though my VMs did get built, they didn't join my pool, and if I look over at Entra ID, they didn't cloud join either. And I'll explain why that happened in just a second, because that's another problem. So let's just delete everything and do the deployment again. And we'll build just like before, but this time we won't build any VMs. Once it's done, go over to your host pool, and we'll first need to solve how AVD is going to connect the service with our hosts. So go to the networking section, and here you can choose which network routes are allowed in your environment. And I'll pick the middle option, which is going to force the session host to only accept traffic from private network connections. And click Save at the bottom. And now click the Private Endpoints tab, create a new endpoint just like we did for storage. The only resource option here we have is for connections, enable your DNS and your tags, and we're done. Now let's just pause right here for a second before we build the VMs, because I promised I'd tell you why cloud joining isn't going to work. Now when you build any VM from AVD to any other kind, you can go over to the Management tab, and you can check this box to enable you to log in with cloud credentials. Then to make this work, the VM underneath gets cloud join. However, when you try to complete that build with a private subnet, it's going to fail. And that's the same problem that we had with the AVD deployment. And here's what's going on. The network requirements for cloud joining require internet access. Now, of course, you could just restore full internet access, and I'll tell you how to do that in just a second. But thankfully, the product teams have until 2025 to work all of this stuff out so that things can work without internet access, but we actually need your help to do that. Start using private endpoints to set things up like you always have. And when you find some kind of scenario that's not working, drop the details in the comments section so I can get that over to the product teams, make sure that they know about private subnets and the problems that you're having so that they can start looking at how to fix it so everything can work without default internet access or maybe the service is just simply gonna require full internet access and you need the other solution, which I'll get to in a second. So for our AVD session hosts, let's try to build again and join to Active Directory. But in order for that to work, you gotta go back to your VNets DNS server, and you gotta set that back to custom to point at your domain controllers, and we're ready to try again, but not so fast. Remember the last time the VMs couldn't download the DSC package. So instead, we're gonna just build normal VMs this time, put them in your availability zones in your region, and then build on the same private subnet as before. Now the steps we need to turn a normal VM into an AVD session host are: first, we need to build the VM, then join it to our domain, and then we need to install 2 agents. And these can be downloaded from the docs right here, and that's linked in the video description. And there are a ton of ways that you could deploy these. And if you're gonna try something like a custom script extension, just keep in mind, you won't have any access to the internet, so you'd have to stage everything into your Azure file share with private endpoint like we looked at before. Either way, when you go to install the agent, you'll be prompted for a token, and then you can generate that from here inside the host pool, and then paste it into your agent and complete the install, and then just do the bootloader next. And of course, all of this can be simply scripted. Then of course, you need to figure out how to set up your file share with private endpoints for FS Logic. So I wonder how authentication will work over there. Well, now you know that losing internet access doesn't mean Azure won't keep on working, but you should also know how to restore full internet access from inside a private subnet, which you can learn about right over here. And happy learning.